She hung 400 meters above the glacier, her frozen fingers clinging to a crack in the ice. Below her, only a cold abyss and jagged rocks hidden beneath a veil of snow. Her cries for help were swallowed by the howling wind, and the rescue camp was more than 10 kilometers away. No one would come. No one would hear her. No one, except him. A massive white stallion stood at the edge of the cliff, staring straight at her. What that wild horse did next defied all logic. The rescuers who found them a day later still refused to believe what they saw. Captain Mark Stoun knew the value of seconds. In 10 years with Alaska's Air Search and Rescue Service, he had pulled more than 100 people back from the brink of death. He had descended on ropes into raging seas to retrieve drowning fishermen. He had cut open the twisted wreckage of crashed aircraft with hydraulic shears. But no operation had ever broken him like the one 18 months ago. A winter storm, a blind landing by instruments, a distress signal from a tourist liner, and his own mistake. 5 seconds too long, one fatal hesitation. 8 people died that day. The rescue commission cleared him, blaming the weather, but Mark knew the truth. He hesitated. Now, at 37, Captain Stoun sat on a low stool in a cramped cabin on the drilling platform, staring at a spot on the wall. The shrill, sickening alarm snapped him out of it. He jumped up, grabbing the radio. "Base, what do we have?" His voice cracked. The dispatcher screamed back, hysterical. "Mark, get to the hangar, now! There are horses. They fell through the ice." Mark rushed onto the deck and froze. The drilling platform, Nord Star, stood moored at the mouth of a frozen river, far from civilization. A white desert stretched endlessly around it. But now that desert was alive. A herd of wild horses, about 20, was panicking on the thinning spring ice. Water had already seeped to the surface. The ice cracked and sagged under their hooves. And at the center of the trap, in a dark opening in the ice, a black stallion struggled desperately, his head barely above freezing water. "Why the hell are they here?" Mark rasped, though he already knew. The horses were migrating south, as they had for centuries, but this year the river had thawed 2 weeks early. "I'm going under," those eyes seemed to say. "And you will do nothing. You always hesitate." Mark sprinted to the snowmobile. He tore off his heavy suit, threw on a light harness, grabbed a rope and an ice axe. The engine roared, and he sped onto the ice. The herd scattered in terror, their hooves cracking the fragile surface even more. Mark stopped 30 meters from the hole. Any closer was suicide. He jumped off and ran, sinking knee-deep into slush. The stallion saw him, thrashed, and sank deeper. Mark dropped to his stomach and crawled the last meters. The horse lashed out, splashing icy water into his face. "Easy, easy, you idiot," Mark shouted, trying to loop the rope around the horse's neck. It failed. His fingers were going numb. His soaked clothes were freezing solid. The stallion was weakening. Another minute, and it would be over. Again, like last time. In desperation, Mark did something he was never taught. He pulled off his gloves, grabbed the horse's freezing face, and pressed his forehead against its own. "Listen to me," he whispered. "We do this together. When I say go, you pull, as hard as you can. Understand?" The stallion went still, its dark eyes locked onto his. For a second, it understood. Mark managed to secure the rope under the horse's chest and tied the other end to his own harness and the safety line trailing from the snowmobile. "Now!" he screamed. "Pull!" The stallion lunged. The ice shattered. Mark was yanked forward, his ice axe torn from his hands and plunged into the freezing water. The cold crushed his chest, stealing his breath. But the rope held. The snowmobile jerked. The line went taut. Mark clung to the stallion's mane as they struggled together in the icy black water. Then, suddenly, the horse stopped thrashing. It planted its hooves against the ice and pushed hard. Mark felt the animal lifting him, using its own strength to drive him upward. They climbed over each other, two desperate creatures bound by a single rope. Then, the snowmobile gave way, sliding backward, tightening the line. That was enough. They were ripped out of the water and thrown onto solid ice. Mark lay on his back, staring at the gray sky, his body turning to ice. Beside him, the stallion breathed heavily, steam rising from its nostrils. It tried to stand, failed, then turned and nudged Mark's face. Once, twice, as if checking if he was alive. The herd waited nearby. An old white stallion called out. The black horse rose, trembling, and limped back to them. Mark couldn't move. He watched them disappear into the white distance. The rescue team reached him 20 minutes later. He was barely alive, his body temperature critically low. He woke up a day later. "You're an idiot, Stone," the supervisor said quietly. "We thought you were dead. That rope nearly cut you in half." Mark said nothing. "You don't get it," the man continued. "We filmed everything. That horse, it wasn't just surviving. It was saving you. It pushed you out, on purpose." Mark closed his eyes. That black gaze returned to him, without fear, with trust. 3 months passed. Mark quit his job. He moved to a small town, bought an old farm, and lived alone. One evening, someone knocked. A woman, a zoologist, stood at his door. "We've been looking for you," she said. "That herd, one stallion broke away. He stays near this area." She pointed to a map. It was his farm. "This morning, we saw him with a drone," she added. "He's standing on a hill, watching your house." Mark stepped outside. There, on a distant hill, stood a dark silhouette, the black stallion. Still, silent, watching. Mark slowly raised his hand. The horse shifted, but didn't leave. It stayed, guarding, waiting. Mark smiled for the first time in months. Sometimes salvation doesn't come when you're pulled from the water. Sometimes it comes later, when you realize you're not alone. That's somewhere out there. Someone remembers. Someone came back to say thank you, or simply to make sure you're still alive. Mark nodded toward the hill and went inside to put the kettle on. For 2, the morning was quiet. Too quiet for this place. No wind, no familiar creak of the old wooden boards of the farmhouse, not even the distant cry of birds. Mark woke before dawn, as if someone had called him. For a moment he lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. And then he realized it wasn't empty. There was anticipation in it. He threw on his jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air burned his lungs. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painted in pale pink. And there, on the same hill, he saw him again. The black stallion. But this time, he was not alone. Beside him stood 2 others, a young mare and a foal, awkwardly shifting on thin legs, small, with a coat as black as night. It pressed close to its mother, but every now and then took a step forward, looking down toward the farmhouse. Mark slowly stepped off the porch. "You brought your family," he said quietly, not even realizing why he spoke aloud. The stallion on the hill raised his head. Their eyes met, just like before, on the ice. No fear, no doubt, only trust. And in that moment, the foal suddenly broke into a run. Unsteady, almost clumsy, it hurried down the slope, slipping on the frozen grass. The mare gave a worried snort, but did not move. She knew he could not be stopped. "Hey, easy there, little one," Mark whispered, taking a step forward. The foal stopped a few meters away. Its dark eyes of Nemetalno studied the man. It stretched out its neck and breathed in the air, filled with the scent of wood, smoke, and something else. Something familiar. Mark slowly crouched down, extending his hand. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The foal took another step, then another, and finally it touched his palm with its warm, damp nose. Warm, alive, real. Mark caught his breath. He gently ran his hand along the foal's soft neck. The little horse flinched but did not pull away. Instead, it pressed closer. From the hill came a soft, drawn-out neigh. Mark looked up. The black stallion was watching him. There was something new in that gaze. Not just gratitude, permission, a trust that no longer needed to be proven. "You're leaving him?" Mark asked, barely above a whisper. The stallion did not move. He just stood there and watched. Mark looked back at the foal, which was now curiously tugging at the edge of his jacket with its lips. "Well then," Mark said quietly, feeling something unfamiliar inside him. Not weight, but warmth. "Looks like I've got a neighbor. Or something more than just a neighbor." The sun rose over the horizon, flooding the valley with soft light. The shadows stretched long. The air grew warmer. When Mark looked up again, the hill was empty. No mare, no stallion. Only the wind gently moving through the grass. He had left, but he hadn't disappeared. Mark lowered his gaze to the foal, now standing beside him, leaning lightly against his leg as if it had always belonged there. And in that moment, he understood something simple that he had never been able to accept before. Sometimes you can't save everyone, but if you save even one, it changes everything. He took a deep breath, looked at the old farmhouse, the empty stalls, the overgrown corral, and for the first time, he didn't see abandonment. He saw possibility. "Come on," he said with a faint smile. "We've got a lot to do." The foal gave a soft snort, as if in agreement, and together they walked toward the house. The days began to flow differently, not faster, deeper. At first, Mark simply watched. The foal stayed close, but didn't allow too much. It followed him at a distance of a few steps, stopped when he stopped, and listened carefully to every sound. Sometimes it would suddenly bolt across the field, as if testing whether the man would disappear if it looked away. But Mark didn't disappear. He fixed the fence, cleaned out the old stalls, hauled water, worked slowly with pauses. His body still remembered the cold of that river. His fingers sometimes refused to obey, and then he would just sit on the porch, warming his hands around a cup of tea. At those moments, the foal came closer. First, one step, then within arm's reach. And then, one day it simply lay down beside him. It happened on the fourth day. The evening was as quiet as that morning. Mark sat with his head lowered and didn't immediately realize that the warm breath beside him wasn't his own. He turned and saw the foal carefully settling onto the ground, folding its legs beneath it. Trust no longer asked for permission. It simply came. "So, that's how it is, huh?" Mark said softly, not moving so as not to scare it. The foal snorted and closed its eyes. Mark watched it for a long time. Then, carefully, he reached out and placed his hand on its warm neck. This time, without trembling. And suddenly, he realized that for the first time in many months, he wasn't remembering that day. He didn't hear the screams, didn't see the fire. Only silence. and that silence no longer pressed down on him. A week passed, then another. The foal now moved freely around the yard, explored the barn, and once even tried to steal an old rope, playing with it for quite a while. Mark found himself smiling. There was something in it that reminded him of his father, who used to say, "If a horse plays, it means it's alive." The name came on its own. "Shadow," Mark said one morning. "You're always nearby, so you'll be Shadow." The foal lifted its head as if responding. From the hills, a distant neigh would sometimes echo. Not every day, not always clearly. But Mark knew he was there, the black stallion. He didn't show himself, didn't come closer, didn't interfere. He simply existed, like a promise, like a boundary that didn't need to be crossed. One night, a storm came, a real northern storm, with cutting wind, stinging snow, and that same deep roar that once meant danger. Mark woke instantly. His heart pounded as if a siren had gone off again. He jumped up and went outside. Shadow was pacing by the corral, frightened, not knowing where to go. The boards creaked, the wind tore at the roof, and for a moment Mark felt like he was back there, on the platform, surrounded by cracking ice. "Easy," he said sharply, more to himself than to the foal. He stepped forward, took Shadow by the neck, and held him close. "It's okay. I'm here." The foal trembled, but didn't pull away. Mark stood there in the wind, holding him, and felt something inside him shifting, not breaking, the opposite, coming together. For the first time, he didn't want to run from fear. He stayed. The storm lasted almost all night. By morning, everything was calm again. Snow covered the ground in a smooth, clean layer. The world grew quiet once more. Mark opened the gate and stepped out into the field, and froze. There were tracks in the snow, large ones, familiar. They began at the edge of the hill, came down, and stopped right by the fence. He had come during the night, stood there, watched. Mark slowly ran his hand along the track, already half covered by drifting snow. "I understand," he said quietly. Shadow stood beside him, pressing against his shoulder. And then, far up on the hill, a silhouette appeared. For a moment, dark, still. Then it disappeared beyond the ridge. Mark didn't go after him, didn't call out. He simply nodded in that direction, just like before, and went back to the house. Now he knew for certain. Some come to save you once, and some come to teach you how to live afterward. Winter returned suddenly, not the way it had before, not gently, not gradually, but sharply, harshly, like a reminder. The wind howled through the mountains, the sky filled with heavy gray clouds, and by evening, a blizzard began. Mark stood by the window, staring into the white emptiness where the hills disappeared. Shadow was restless. He paced in circles, lifting his head, listening to the wind, and from time to time letting out a quiet snort. There was something different in him, not fear, a premonition. "What do you feel?" Mark asked softly. And at that moment, a sound broke through. Distant, faint, but familiar. A neigh, not just one. Mark threw the door open and stepped into the storm. The wind struck his face, the snow nearly blinded him, but he still moved forward and froze. Through the white storm, like ghosts, shapes were moving. First one, then another, then dozens. A herd. They moved slowly, heavily, forcing their way through the snow. Exhausted, weakened, but they kept going. Here, to him. Shadow gave a quiet answering neigh and darted forward, but stopped at the edge of the yard as if understanding. The decision wasn't his to make. Mark stared, unable to believe his eyes, and then he saw him, the black stallion. He walked in front, slowly, limping badly, but not stopping. And when he came close enough for Mark to see his eyes, everything became clear. He hadn't come. He had led them. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the cold burn his chest, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't hesitate. Not even for a second. He turned and ran, opened the old gates, threw open the stalls, tore down the latches. "Come on, this way, quickly!" he shouted over the howling wind. The horses froze for a moment, and then they moved, one by one, into warmth, into shelter, into life. Mark stood in the snow until the last of them passed him. The black stallion lingered. Their eyes met again, like before, on the ice. But now there was no pain in that gaze, no desperation, only calm and completion. The stallion gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and walked past him, into the shelter, as if he knew it was time. Mark closed the gates, breathing heavily. Inside, it was loud, warm, alive. Shadow already stood among the herd, for the first time, not alone. Mark leaned against the wall, feeling something run down his cheeks, snow, or maybe tears. He hadn't saved them all back then. But now he had made it in time. And in that moment, he understood. Sometimes life gives you a second chance. Not so you can fix everything, but so you no longer fear taking action. The wind still howled outside, but inside, it was quiet. And for the first time in many years, it felt right. Thank you for watching and spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story.